Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I think we have a few folks still coming in the room, but we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Carrie Riddle, and I'm the Deputy Director with the Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis, or CINA Center, and we're a DHS Center of Excellence here at George Mason University. And thanks for joining us online today for the next session in our Distinguished Speaker Series, where we host a series of talks exploring topics related to CINA's research footprint, which is broadly centered around approaches to understanding and addressing organized crime. Just a quick reminder to please keep your microphones muted throughout the session today. And following today's talk, we'll have a Q&A session will be kindly moderated by CINA's director, Dr. Jim Jones. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat at any point throughout the session today. And for folks watching through YouTube, feel free to send us an email with your question. The address to use is cina@gmu.edu. As we continue into fall, I'd just like to quickly highlight another one of our upcoming events. This fall, CINA is very pleased to co-sponsor an upcoming hackathon focusing on solutions to combat counterfeit products. The event is being jointly organized by the Track Center at Mason and also by Amazon. And the hackathon is open to teams from all backgrounds and skill sets. To learn more about the hackathon and how to sign up and also learn more about other CINA events, please visit our website, cina.gmu.edu. And this afternoon, it's a pleasure to welcome and introduce our speaker, Dr. Arun Ross. Dr. Ross is a professor in computer science and engineering at Michigan State University and is the director of the Integrated Pattern Recognition and Biometrics Lab and is also a site director of the NSF Center for Identification Technology Research. Dr. Ross is also the PI for some ongoing CINA-funded research that's examining specific challenges with biometric systems, such as morph attack detection, latent fingerprint matching, and presentation attack detection. And his team at Michigan State are developing techniques and technology to support DHS in addressing some of these challenges. Arun conducts research on several topics, including biometrics, privacy, computer vision, and deep learning. And he is the recipient of several awards recognizing his contributions to these fields, including a prestigious NSF Career Award. Dr. Ross has advocated for the responsible use of biometrics in many forums, including NATO and United Nations forums and events. And he also recently testified at the US House Space, Science, and Technology Committee on the topic of biometrics and personal privacy. The title of his talk today is Privacy in the Era of Automated Face Recognition. Dr. Ross, we're very pleased to have you here today. And if you're ready, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Kerry, for the kind introduction. And Jim and Kerry, thank you again for inviting me to give this talk. I'd like to thank Sarah as well for all the arrangements made. So I'm not in person in GMU, but hopefully one day I'll be able to meet many of you in person. But I'm glad that we have this opportunity to discuss something about privacy in the context of automated face recognition. So once again, thanks for the kind introduction. And what I would like to do in this presentation is first start out with some background in biometrics, and then speak primarily about the privacy implications of the technology. I want to specify the bottom line right away, which is that face recognition has improved by leaps and bounds. At the same time, there are some privacy concerns, which researchers are continually addressing as through various types of research activities, including those funded by CINA. So clearly, the technology needs improvement, but having said that, the massive advances in the technology should not be ignored. So I direct the iProbe lab, the Integrated Pattern Recognition and Biometrics lab here at Michigan State University. We have a number of PhD students and master's students assisting with the research, and the lab has graduated a number of PhD and master's thesis students in the past. And so if you are here in Michigan, please feel free to stop by in East Lansing, and we'll be glad to host you here. The research theme, as far as biometrics is concerned, in our lab kind of revolves around these three topics that you're seeing on this slide. Adversarial biometrics, privacy of biometrics, and then biometric fusion. And there are other research activities that are also ongoing in our lab related to medical imaging, autonomous driving, plant phenotyping, and so on and so forth. But much of the research is invested in the field of biometrics. So what is biometrics? Just to ensure that we're all on the same page, please allow me to provide a brief background, which might be redundant to many, but nevertheless, I think it is important that we state a few things about the technology itself. So when we say biometrics, we're talking about automated recognition of individuals based on their biological and behavioral characteristics. And some of the keywords are highlighted in that first bullet point. We are talking about a technology that is automated, or at least semi-automated. Secondly, we're talking about recognition of individuals, something that I will highlight later on. And recognition can entail verification or identification. Verification is when I make a claim to an identity. So I would say, well, I'm Arun Ross, and then I would offer my biometric trait having made that claim, and then the system will use the biometric trait to either confirm or refute that claim. Another aspect of recognition is identification, where I walk up to the system and I don't really make a claim to an identity. I just offer my biometric trait, and then the system takes that information, compares it against the entries in the database, and then makes a final determination as to whether I'm in the database or not. And if I'm in the database, then what my identity is. So recognition is really a broad term here. But what I'd like to focus on is the notion of these being biological and behavioral characteristics. And that is something that is relevant in this discussion as we talk about face recognition. Now, these biometric traits, as we call them, ought to have two important properties. One is called as uniqueness. That means we'll have to be able to use these traits to distinguish between individuals. We call that as uniqueness. And then we have permanence, which means these features that are being extracted from an individual have to be repeatable. If they were to change every second, clearly that does not constitute a biometric trait. So uniqueness and persistence or permanence are two defining attributes of any biometric trait. On the right, you see what is commonly referred to as the Berthian card. Alphonse Berthian in France in the late 19th century, he devised a mechanism by which people can be recognized. He kind of made it a science by measuring certain attributes of the individual, mostly what we would call as geometric or anthropometric features, and then augmenting it with a photograph and defining this card, which could be indexed and then used to recognize an individual if the person were to appear again in a police station. Now, when we talk about modern biometrics, we have many different traits that are being researched. You see fingerprints, palm prints, iris, voice, signature, you have face, DNA, and what you see here, if you can see my pointer, this one is conjunctival vasculature. The vasculature patterns that are visible through the sclera of the eye. You have ear patterns, typing patterns, dental patterns, gait, the way a person walks, hand geometry, vasculature of the hand or the palm, and then also ECG and so on and so forth. So you have a spectrum of different biometric traits, and it must be noted that not all biometric traits have been intensely investigated. Some modalities, however, have been intensively investigated. We can think of fingerprints, face, iris, voice. These have been researched extensively, and many other modalities, including those listed in this particular slide, are being investigated thoroughly as well. The point of the slide is, of course, to show that there are multiple biometric traits that are potentially available, but not all of them have been investigated thoroughly. Now, before we go into this whole topic of privacy of this technology and so on, I'd like to give some of the engineering aspects of the technology. And so if you were to ask, what does a biometric system consist of? Then really we can reduce it to 4 different components. And those 4 different components are what I will explain in this particular slide very quickly. So you have a sensor, think of a fingerprint sensor or a camera to capture the face. The sensor converts the physical trait or the behavioral trait to digital data. It translates it from the physical realm to the digital realm. That's the role of the sensor. And then you have a feature extractor, which extracts some features from the digital data. And what you see here exemplified are minutia points atop a fingerprint image. Clearly, this has been processed. And so these red points that you see here correspond to what we would call as minutia points, rich bifurcations and rich endings. And the constellation of these points are believed to be unique to an individual. So once features are extracted, then you need a comparator, sometimes referred to colloquially as a matcher, which compares 2 extracted feature sets and produces a score. And so notice here that you have 2 sets of fingerprint, or rather 2 fingerprints, and you have 2 sets of minutia points, and a comparator would try to find the correspondence between these minutia points in order to establish whether these 2 fingerprints originate from the same person or if they originate from 2 different people. And then you have a 4th component referred to as the database or gallery. And that is where the templates of individuals are stored. So for example, user 1, their template, their biometric template, which means their biometric feature set, is stored along with an identifier. The identifier here would be the labels that you see here: user 01, user 02, user 03, etc. And so during the recognition operation, the database will be invoked because you can then take the probe image, as we call it, that is the data that is provided at the time of, say, verification or identification. And the probe is compared against the gallery database in order to establish a person's identity or to confirm or even refute their claim to an identity. So sensor, feature extractor, comparator, and then a database or gallery. These are the 4 components of a classical biometric system. Many different applications ranging from healthcare to border control security to access control on smartphones, ATMs, also used in refugee services and so on. And clearly, the application arena of biometrics is constantly increasing because there are many applications where a person has to prove their identity, either in the verification mode or in the identification mode. There is a need to determine who a person is before they access, for example, a certain resource or enter a country, and so on and so forth. So this is to say that biometrics has a vast application arena. And as we will see shortly, the technology is evolving rapidly. And so some of the concerns related to privacy have to be carefully handled and mitigated so that the technology can be appropriately used. So let's take automated face recognition. And what is automated face recognition? Well, one way of looking at it is you have 2 face images, and you determine if these 2 images originate from the same person or if they originate from 2 different people. And so in that sense, statistically speaking, given two face images, you want to estimate two numbers, two probabilities, if you will. One is the likelihood, assuming that they are of the same person. That means the likelihood of seeing these two faces under the condition they are of the same person, what we call as the conditional probability distribution function. And then the likelihood, assuming they are of different people. And so these two likelihoods have to be computed, and they can be combined to give a match score, which would tell us how similar or dissimilar these two images are. And often based on the degree of similarity or the degree of dissimilarity, one would say that, well, they belong to the same person, or, well, they do not belong to the same person. And again, here the point of the slide is to say that both these likelihoods are important. We don't want to bias the system by saying, well, it has to match, namely that these two images have to match. We don't bias it. We give the opportunity to compute both likelihoods, one under the assumption they're of the same person, one under the assumption that the other under the assumption that they are of different people. Now, if we look at some of the evaluations conducted by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, you will see that the performance of face recognition has improved by leaps and bounds. And this is a very important observation to be made. So, for example, in their 2018 report, NIST makes the following observations. They had a gallery size of 1.6 million identities. If you recall, gallery is the database of biometric templates. And so you have 1.6 million identities, which means 1.6 million individuals are enrolled. You can view it in that fashion. And I'm quoting from their report now. The most accurate algorithm in 2018 gives a false negative identification rate of 0.002. That's 0.2%. Now, if you compare that with their 2014 result, the 2014 result, the FNIR was 0.041. False negative identification rate is when the system does not recognize an individual, even if the individual is in the database. So obviously you want FNIR to be lower. The point of this statement is that this constitutes almost a 20-fold reduction in false negatives, 20-fold over 4 years. And the final bullet point is the most important thing in this slide. The massive accuracy gains are consistent with an industrial revolution associated with the incorporation of convolutional neural network-based techniques into the prototypes. In other words, the algorithms that were evaluated through by NIST, the massive accuracy gains that many of them exhibited could be attributed to CNNs, convolutional neural network based techniques. And so in short, one could say that CNNs have radically changed the landscape of not only face recognition, but also other fields in computer vision and machine learning. And so clearly that benefit, which we see in other computer vision based technologies, we are now seeing in the context of biometrics as well. So if you look at another statement from their 2021 report, talking about NIST, they say the major result was that massive gains in accuracy have been achieved in the years 2013 to 2018, and these far exceed improvements made in the prior period. And so if you look at the diagram here at the bottom, it is taken from a CVPR 2014 paper by Teigman et al. Titled Deep Face, Closing the Gap to Human Level Performance in Face Verification. And that was one of the earliest papers that demonstrated that automated face recognition performance can exceed human performance. That is, when humans are involved in the process of comparing faces. And so this radically changed the landscape. And since then, because it's now over 8 years, since then, tremendous progress has been made in the field of face recognition, with the system even being able to correctly recognize faces that are extremely small or of low resolution. So I'm not going to talk much about CNNs, convolutional neural networks, just to point out that CNNs can automatically learn what type of features to extract from the face image. And this is important because in an earlier slide, I said one of the components of a biometric system is, in fact, the feature extractor. And sometimes designing the feature extractor can be very challenging. But CNNs can automatically learn from the data what type of features have to be extracted. And this is a heavily data-driven approach. So it means you require a large number of training samples, for example, a large number of face images. And training can be computationally very expensive and might require multiple GPUs. But the actual online matching can be done very quickly, very rapidly. So CNNs, again, kind of repeating myself, but CNNs have completely changed the landscape of automated face recognition. At the same time, concerns about demographic biases have also been reasonably mitigated. Not fully solved, but tremendous progress has been made to reduce demographic biases. What is demographic bias? Demographic bias is when the performance of a face recognition system is non-uniform across different demographic groups. But if you take the top 20 NIST FRBT algorithms, that means the top 20 performing NIST algorithms, NIST FRBT algorithms, these are not necessarily algorithms developed by NIST, but algorithms evaluated by NIST. You will notice that all 20 of them, they worked most accurately on the demographic group labeled as male Black. And similarly, you can see the second most accurate, the third most accurate, and the least accurate, how many algorithms had that distribution of performance from the top 20. The point being that while demographic bias is definitely of concern, researchers have moved ahead in order to see how these problems can be mitigated, and they have been reasonably successful. So now let's turn to privacy, and I'd just like to play this video. The copyright rests with BBC, and I hope you can hear the audio as well. I'll just play a snippet of this video.
现在2号机是锁起门的。对，就是这的。
Well, let's see how long it takes you to find me. Thank you very much. Let's go.
我们可以追溯到说，出现每一张脸都可以对应说他的身份证，以及他所经过，比方说在过去1周，我们回溯他的行经路程，我们也做了像人和车的匹配。那同时在人上匹配还包括亲属关系匹配，然后是你经常接触人员之间匹配。就是当摄像机布到或者我们传感器布到一定密度的时候，其实我们会经常知道你跟谁经常在一起。
Well, here we are then. I've just got out of the car, close to the city centre, and for the purposes of this exercise, the plan is for me to start walking in the direction of the bus station. My image has already been flagged to the authorities as a suspect, and in theory, it should only be a matter of time. So already on this bridge, I can see 1, 2, 3 CCTV cameras. Of course, there's no point hiding from them. Just keep on walking.
可以呢，不一定非要从门里头通过，他就站在。哎，对，就是这里，就是这里。对，就是这里。
Uh-oh. Right behind me, you can see just over my left shoulder there. Hello, guys. I've been expecting you. Maybe these guys aren't in on the joke.
So the point I wish to make with respect to that brief snippet from this documentary is to show that face recognition is very powerful, that potentially you can use this to identify an individual, recognize an individual from a massive database of enrolled face images or labeled face images. And this is one reason why privacy is of great concern with respect to the technology, notwithstanding the massive improvements in performance. At the same time, the other concern is when a person is misidentified, because the ramifications there can be tremendous. And so therefore, any errors by the system or any breach in privacy can lead to some unintended consequences. So this is one reason why privacy has taken a front seat in the context of biometrics. And in our in one of our papers in 2021, a joint work across multiple universities, we did a comprehensive survey of privacy enhancing face biometrics. How can you enhance the privacy attributes of the technology? Because often we focus on privacy being breached, but we don't focus enough on the techniques that have already been developed and are being developed in order to mitigate some of these privacy concerns. So what is the importance of privacy? And I must mention, I'm sure there are many students in this audience, that often when we develop technology, we sometimes don't pay heed to the societal perception of the technology and the potential implications it might have on their privacy. And when we start looking at all these attendant concerns with respect to the technology, we are more likely to mitigate some of those concerns beforehand than encounter those concerns after the technology is deployed. So privacy is the right to be let alone, said Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis in their classical law review paper in 1890. And then Alan Weston, I quote Alan Weston in 1970, said, privacy is the claim of individuals, groups, or institutions to determine for themselves when, how, and to what extent information about them is communicated to others. Alan Weston was an advocate for consumer privacy. And then Richard Posner, arguably one of the most cited scholars, legal scholars in the 20th century, he said, privacy is the right of people to conceal information about themselves that others might use to their disadvantage. And so while there is some level of intersection between privacy and security, at the same time, we must point out that there are some important differences between privacy and security. And so you see some phrases that I've highlighted in red in this particular slide. The right to be let alone, quoting directly from the law review paper, to determine for themselves, and then to be able to conceal information as well. But then when we talk about biometrics, right away we begin to see that the technology is designed to recognize individuals, which means everything that we said here is breached right away, because the purpose of the technology is to be able to recognize individuals. If that purpose is undermined, then the utility of that technology no longer exists. And so what is important here is to retain the utility of the technology, namely to recognize individuals, but to do that in a very responsible way and in a manner that can still preserve privacy. So let's look at these two terms, identity versus recognition, just to make a very simple point here. Now, biometrics in itself cannot deduce identity. Now, that might seem to be counterintuitive, but just hang in there with me as I go through this slide. But biometrics can be used to recognize the trait of a person. So suppose I have a fingerprint like this. Let's call that as the probe or the input fingerprint. Based on a single fingerprint image, we cannot say this belongs to, say, Jane Doe. We cannot say that. The fingerprint is not going to speak up and say, well, I belong to Jane Doe. The fingerprint is just lying there. The utility of that fingerprint is borne out when you compare it with a set of database entries, but also with a set of labeled database entries. Here we call them as references. So in other words, we need a reference fingerprint image that is known to belong to Jane Doe in order to make the assessment that the input fingerprint indeed is that of Jane Doe. And that comes about when we compare these two fingerprints and are able to assess and estimate the degree of similarity between them. And if that degree of similarity is very high, exceeding a certain threshold, then we would say, well, these two fingerprints are linked. And because this belongs to Jane Doe, therefore this also belongs to Jane Doe. But then I can manipulate the label and say, well, the reference image belongs to James Bond, in which case the upper fingerprint would be deemed to belong to James Bond. And this is why we cannot say biometrics in itself can deduce identity. We cannot say that. What biometrics can do is it can recognize. And if you look at the etymological basis of the word recognition, we understand that there is some element of recall, recollection. That means it has seen the fingerprint before, it sees it now, it's able to establish that these two originate from the same finger. And therefore, if this belongs to Jane Doe, then the upper fingerprint also belongs to Jane Doe. Now, the reason for this discussion is to point out the boundaries of the technology. Yes, the technology can be used to deduce identity, but in itself, it cannot deduce identity unless you have a labeled database. And we assume that the database is labeled accurately with the correct identity being associated with the templates. But even if we didn't have a pair of fingerprints like we demanded in this slide, in order to have biometric utility, even if we don't have a pair of images, with just a single image or a single biometric sample, we can derive some information about the unknown individual. And so, for example, age, gender, ethnicity can be automatically derived from the face image. That means a trained classifier or a regressor may be used to automatically deduce certain what we call as soft biometric attributes. Age, gender, and ethnicity are often referred to as soft biometric attributes. So there are many face analytic software that can take this image and estimate gender, age, health, some information about their eyesight, and in some cases, even the ethnicity. And one must be cautious here because often in the biometric literature, the terms gender, sex, race, ethnicity are not used in the strict sense, but in a very general sense. But the point of this slide is to show that there are ways by which you can harness a trained classifier or a regressor to automatically deduce certain soft biometric attributes. So even if you don't have a matching identity in the database, with a single image, you're still able to extract some attributes of the unknown individual. Now, the same thing can be done with other biometric modalities as well. And here you see an iris image. And often when we see the iris image, we admire the textural aspects of the iris, the richness of the texture, and so on. And the richness of this texture is often reduced to a mere binary code. But if you were to go back to the texture one can devise automated attribute classifiers that can extract information such as age, sex, race, or even anatomical details of the iris, like the distribution of crypts, the location of Wolflin nodules, the location of pigmentation spots. And automated techniques can also be used to determine which sensor was used to acquire the iris and the wavelength in which the image was acquired, or even if the image was acquired in an indoor setting or in an outdoor setting. In some cases, using a single iris image, one could determine some pathological conditions such as stromal atrophy, or also some other auxiliary details. For example, if the person is wearing a contact lens or not, and what is their pupil dilation level. Now, to be sure, not all information can be reliably extracted, but all these pieces of information can be aggregated. So what we're seeing here is that given a single biometric sample, even if it can't be used to recognize an individual, you can still extract these auxiliary information or ancillary information, if you will, from that biometric sample. So this is another way where we see that privacy can be leaked, or information, I must say, is leaked, thereby potentially breaching the privacy of the person, because the person who offers the biometric trait may not have given consent for all these other pieces of information to be extracted. They gave the biometric sample in order to be recognized, but not for these other purposes. But at the same time, one can see some benefits of extracting soft biometric attributes. So it should not be, they should not be outrightly dismissed. So for example, even in the case of an iris, you can extract attributes such as, is this person a male? What camera was used to take a picture of this iris? You can even give a commentary about the iris, that in this case, the iris stroma is plain textured, and also indicate the pupil parameters, suggesting that this is a highly constricted pupil, thereby suggesting the existence of strong external illumination. So as you can see, there are really two sides of the same coin. On one hand, being able to extract these pieces of information from a single biometric sample in an automated manner, the key word is automated, one could claim, well, this bridges the gap between human and machine descriptions of data, because the description that you see on the right here, where my pointer is pointing to, is something that humans can relate to, a human can understand, rather than saying, well, this iris is 0010111. But converting it into some kind of a textual description automatically would then bridge the gap between human and machine descriptions of data. On the other hand, as is evident, can this compromise privacy, because the individual who offered the data did not expect for these pieces of information to be automatically extracted. Other things can be done with face images. Many of you might have heard of this face to gene application. And in face to gene, you're given a face image. It extracts facial descriptors, and it then matches them with what are called as syndrome gestalts. And these syndrome gestalts are pointing to certain genetic attributes of the individual. So you're mapping the face of an individual to potentially genetic disorders that that person might have, or genetic ailments that that person might have or might be subject to. So clearly here, there are some benefits for doing that, as can be seen in this quotation that you see here. But at the same time, one could be concerned about the breach of privacy. And a third example here, the first example I gave was the extraction of soft biometric attributes. The second example I gave is where health details, in this case, genetic attributes of the individual, can be gleaned. Now, here is a third example. This is from earlier work by Alessandro Acquisti from Carnegie Mellon University. The work is titled Faces of Facebook, Privacy in the Age of Augmented Reality. It really talks about the convergence of three technologies: face recognition, cloud computing, or GPUs, and online social networks. So you start from an anonymous face in the street, And you compare that face with faces that are gleaned from online social networks, where faces are uploaded every second, or even with greater frequency. So you take a picture of someone's face and you compare it with this curated set of faces that have been downloaded from online social networks. And potentially you can now get additional pieces of information about that subject walking down the street. Maybe information like their name or their address or even their date of birth, because people might post many personal details in some of these online social networks. So you start potentially with an anonymous face in the street, and you end up with very sensitive information about the person through a process called data accretion, because you're connecting the dots between multiple sources of information and then building a comprehensive profile of an individual. In fact, Acquisty's earlier work in 2009, they developed techniques to predict social security numbers of individuals based on publicly available data. And so face recognition can be combined with their prediction algorithms in order to take someone's face and even predict their social security number from public data. Now, clearly, this is not 80% accurate or 90% accurate or 60% accurate, but even if it's 5% accurate, it poses a problem, because then you're unmasking sensitive details of 5% of individuals, but clearly it is much more than 5%. Another concern that has been articulated is the curation of face databases for research. And often, I shouldn't say often anymore. I used to say often 10 years ago, but it's no longer as frequent as before. But people and researchers can download face images from the web, curate them, and use them to evaluate the performance of their face recognition algorithms, or even develop new face recognition algorithms by using this downloaded data as training data. And over the past few years, many of these databases have been withdrawn from the public domain. And the reason is people have objected to their face images being used for the development of face recognition technology, because they did not give consent to such an activity. And so we are seeing some face databases that have been used in the past by researchers for both algorithm development and evaluation now being rescinded because of privacy concerns of those individuals whose faces are in these databases. And so there are several databases that have been withdrawn. So this raises the issue of lawful data processing, and the European Union's GDPR outlines some metrics and some factors that have to be considered rather, in order to ensure that data is appropriately used in a manner that is fair toward the individuals as well as transparent to the individuals. Define the purpose, perform data minimization, ensure that the data is accurate, do not store the data for longer than necessary, and at the same time, ensure use of appropriate means to safeguard data against unauthorized access. So in this vein, as we come toward the last part of this talk, there are many techniques that are being developed or have been developed for the purpose of imparting privacy to face images. And several of these technologies that I will describe very briefly is due to funding from agencies such as the Department of Homeland Security. And it is important to make that note that the very agencies that would like the technology to succeed are also investing in ensuring that the privacy of individuals can be enhanced or retained. Maybe a few years back, researchers were oblivious to the challenges that would be posed by privacy and security, but not so anymore. Even in research labs in universities, students are being increasingly educated about the importance of developing technology that is responsible, in the sense that privacy and security concerns are addressed upfront and not as an afterthought. Having said that, here are some techniques that researchers have developed. One is homomorphic encryption, where all computations are performed in the encrypted domain, which means the original image never has to be stored. Everything is stored in the encrypted domain, and also the matching operation happens in the encrypted domain. And then the notion of cancelable biometrics, the second bullet point here, where the data is intentionally distorted before using it for biometric recognition. So the importance here is it preempts the possibility of linking the biometric data of an individual across applications, because each application would have its own distortion function, and therefore it cannot be compatible with another application where a different distortion function is used. And then the notion of semi-adversarial networks. In semi-adversarial networks, these are neural networks, the input face image is perturbed in a certain way so that its biometric utility is retained, but the ability to extract additional attributes such as age, sex, race, etc. is obscured. And that's why it is semi-adversarial, adversarial to certain attributes and not adversarial to other attributes. And then the generation of synthetic data, because when we talk about massive databases that are needed to train face recognition algorithms, we talk about curating data from the web, which clearly poses a problem. But if you use synthetic data, can we then circumvent the problem of using real data? Well, yes and no. The generation of synthetic data is indeed useful for the purposes of training face recognition algorithms. On the other hand, the mechanism by which synthetic data is generated requires real data, because you need a way to train these GANs, as we call them, generative adversarial neural networks. So therefore, there is a balance that we ought to consider when synthetic data are used. And then the last point here is the development of privacy sensors. This is a very exciting topic. Think of a surveillance camera and think about the images that it's acquiring. Now, what if that surveillance camera is built in such a way that it can only image certain aspects of a person's face, and all other aspects are obscured or obfuscated? That means at no point in time will the original image be ever available, because the sensor is itself perturbing the scene that it's acquiring. And so if this is coupled with semi-adversarial networks, what would happen is that the image acquired by the sensor or by the camera is already distorted. And so it can be used only for some purposes and not for other purposes. And there is no way we can access the original image, because the distortion happened at the sensor level, even perhaps at the optics level. So this brings us to the final topic here, controllable privacy. Is there a way that the data that is being provided by a user, can it be regulated such that certain attributes are revealed and other attributes are suppressed? And in this regard, we have developed what is called as a semi-adversarial neural network. A semi-adversarial neural network is an autoencoder. It takes an input image, maps it to an output image, but the output image has some attributes. It can be successfully used by, say, a face matcher, but it can't be successfully used by a gender classifier, for example. So that's why it is semi-adversarial, because some attributes are retained in order for recognition to be successful, but other attributes are deliberately perturbed or suppressed. So I won't go into the details. I'm just going to very briefly move over the next few slides just to show how these type of autoencoders can be designed. You have one neural network here mapping the input to the output, and then you have another neural network here which is regulating the output by ensuring that face matching can be correctly done. And then you have a third network here which is also regulating the output in such a way that certain attributes are suppressed. And we have different configurations of these SANs, as we call them, an ensemble of SANs, in some cases, a sequence of SANs. There are many different architectures that we have developed, and all these are reported in our recent papers. But one of our more recent work has to do with the development of PrivacyNet. It is a cycle GAN. And what a PrivacyNet does is that certain attributes are retained and other attributes can be suppressed. In our original SAN work, we could only deal with a single attribute at a time. But in PrivacyNet, you can deal with multiple attributes. So we call that as multi-attribute privacy. So what I'm going to do is go directly to an illustration and then bring this presentation to a close. So here you have a face image of an individual. And you see here, just below that image, you see the text which says original label, and we say 011. That corresponds to female, middle-aged, Caucasian, for example. And now you change the target label, and you make it male, middle-aged, Caucasian. And what happens to the original image? By the way, what you see here is a three-dimensional space, gender, age, and race. Let's assume those are the three attributes that have to be considered. So now what happened here is the original image, upon encountering the target label, would be changed. That means the original image would be perturbed, and so now you have a new image. And then if you change the target label to say female, old, Caucasian, then again, it'll move in this three-dimensional space. So it's an illustration. Obviously, it's a very high-dimensional space, but at least these three factors are controlling the generation of images in this high-dimensional space. And then if you were to change the target label further, then you notice that the image now moves along in the space, and it looks different from the original image. And so you can go through this process. You can even change two attributes at a time, as you can see here, and or even change all three attributes of the individual. Now, this kind of summarizes what happened in the previous slides. You have the original image here, which could be used by a face matcher, M, which was correctly used by a gender classifier, which could be used by an age classifier, or even by a race classifier. That's why you see the check marks here. But by using PrivacyNet, you can impart controllable privacy. For example, if you look at this image, it can be used by a face matcher, it can be used by a gender classifier and by an age classifier, but not by a race classifier. And if you go down to this image, it can be used by a matcher, but not by any of the other attribute classifiers. And this process is generalizable. It is not applicable to only one kind of gender classifier or one kind of age classifier or one kind of race classifier. Even those classifiers that have not been previously observed can be confounded using this method. But if you look at this set of images, in all cases, the matcher is still working. But it's only those other attributes that are being selectively suppressed. So here are some examples. Again, as I said, this is focus is on automated face recognition and automated attribute classifiers. Clearly, from a human perspective, you would say that these images have been distorted. Visual realism is something that we're still working on. So what do we see here? We see the original image from one of the data sets that is commonly used in our field. And here you see the output of a classical GAN. And in the middle, you see the output of PrivacyNet. And if you look at the match scores, you will notice that pertaining to three different matchers, you notice that the match scores here would suggest that this image can be matched with the original image. But if you use a typical GAN, then or a standard GAN, then you notice that the match scores have dropped significantly, suggesting to us that the biometric utility of this image has been revoked. But in our case, the biometric utility has been retained, but other attributes have been selectively suppressed. And here's another example, the original image, and then you have the one generated by our algorithm and another generated by a classical GAN. And what you notice again is that the match scores would suggest that the original and the modified image can be successfully matched, whereas in the case of the GAN modified image, classical GAN modified image, the matchability is lost. So let me wrap this up here with just a couple slides. So we talked about semi-adversarial network very quickly. It is adversarial to some classifiers and not to others. And so it can be used to provide demographic privacy to face images while still retaining matching utility. And so this is what we would call as controllable privacy. And now we are trying to extend this to differential privacy. Of course, the visual realism of images has to be improved. While the face matcher is able to successfully process it, we would also like to ensure that a human reviewing these images might also not find some of these artifacts, so that the visual realism is retained. So what is the takeaway from this brief talk? Well, firstly, automated face recognition is a powerful and useful technology. The accuracy of the technology has improved by leaps and bounds over the past decade, thanks to funding from many agencies. Further issues like demographic biases are being addressed. However, legitimate concerns about privacy persist. And what must be said, that researchers are developing techniques to ensure that the privacy of individuals can be retained. In other words, privacy is no longer an afterthought in the design of a biometric system. Rather, as the system is developed, researchers and others are focusing on the privacy and security implications of that technology. And that shift in culture bodes well for the technology. Clearly, there are concerns about the technology, both in terms of its privacy implications, but also in terms of it making mistakes that can cause tremendous havoc. But nevertheless, we cannot ignore the rapid improvements in the technology, and we cannot ignore the investment that has been made to ensure that the technology can be responsibly used.